In the MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas, a martial arts legend sat quietly ringside, seemingly just another spectator. What began as a night of sanctioned MMA fights turned deadly serious when Steven Seagal insulted Chuck Norris in front of thousands, calling him a washed-up fighter. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical retired action star. For decades, he was a 6-time world karate champion and a U.S. Air Force veteran known for dominating real tournaments long before memes turned him into a myth. When Seagal crossed the line with public disrespect, he had no idea he was provoking a man forged in true competition. Norris's calm, deliberate rise from his seat became the strategic response that would trigger a storm far beyond stage theatrics. What began as a war of words became a reckoning inside the octagon. The MGM Grand, and the martial arts community at large, would never be the same after two legends turned the spotlight into the ultimate face-off. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A brutal punch echoed across the arena, sending the fighter crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped as the referee dove in, checking if the man could even move. But the winner was already parading around, arms raised high, grin stretched wide. He strutted past the cameras, leaned over his opponent, and shouted insults. Loud, cocky, unapologetic. Some fans roared with excitement. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Not far from the cage, front row, Steven Seagal sat watching, expression unreadable. No clapping, no reaction, just sharp, steady eyes locked on the fighter. 2 seats down, Chuck Norris observed quietly, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. The MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas pulsed with raw energy. Every seat filled, every voice blending into a deafening roar that echoed off the walls. Floodlights beamed down onto the polished cage at center stage. Cameras flashed like lightning as fans shouted from every corner. Some waved banners, others leaned forward on the edge of their seats, eyes locked on the fighters. The night's energy felt alive, almost electric, charged with the promise of something big. In the middle of this chaos sat Steven Seagal, imposing and self-assured, ringside in the VIP section. Dressed in a silk black button-up, dark jeans, and tinted glasses, he commanded attention without effort. His salt and pepper ponytail hung perfectly still. No entourage surrounded him. Yet everyone knew he was there. He sat, with legs spread wide, one arm draped confidently over the empty chair beside him. He nodded to the occasional fan who dared approach, but otherwise remained aloof, surveying the scene like a king overseeing his realm. Just a short distance away, Chuck Norris sat with his wife, understated in a simple button-down shirt and blazer. Unlike Seagal, he seemed content to blend in. He smiled and signed a program for a young fan, then returned his attention to the cage. No flashy gestures, no attention-seeking. At 75, his body still looked solid, the result of decades of disciplined training. His eyes showed the wisdom of years, the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove. All eyes inside the cage, however, centered on one man, the undefeated young fighter, Aiden, the Assassin Reynolds, whose name everyone had chanted earlier. A rising star, not just for his skill but for how he won. Arrogant, flashy, ruthless. He thrived on spectacle, lived to dominate not only his opponent but the crowd. Every move he made seemed calculated to provoke a reaction. He bounced on his heels, glancing at the cameras, soaking in the attention. Fans either loved him or hated him, but no one ignored him. Across the cage stood his opponent, Miguel Ortiz, a seasoned veteran with years of fights under his belt. Respected, not flashy. not arrogant, the kind who let his skills speak quietly. But none of that mattered tonight. From the moment the bell rang, Aiden attacked. Fast, aggressive, sharp, relentless. His strikes came in hard, giving Ortiz no space to breathe. The veteran fought back, but the younger man controlled the pace as if he had something to prove. It ended brutally. A quick combination, a clean hit to the jaw, and Ortiz hit the mat hard. The sound of impact echoed. The referee dove in, signaling the fight was over. Medics rushed into the cage, checking if the fallen fighter could move. The crowd erupted. Some fans screamed wildly, thrilled by the show. Others shifted uncomfortably at how fast, how ruthless it had been. But the winner didn't care. He strutted around the cage, arms raised high, flexing for cameras, playing to the crowd, sweat dripping, grin wide. He shouted at the fans, mocking Ortiz openly. No humility, no restraint. That's what happens when you step into my cage, he shouted, voice echoing through the arena's speakers. Who else wants some? Commentators barely had time to react. And Reynolds, with another spectacular knockout, the lead announcer said, trying to maintain professionalism despite the fighter's antics. His 6th straight victory, though his post-fight behavior continues to raise eyebrows. Yet amidst all this noise, Steven Seagal finally moved. He leaned back in his seat, a hint of a smile crossing his face as he nodded in approval at Reynolds' display of dominance. He clapped 3 slow, deliberate claps, the gesture of a man who recognized something of himself in the brash young fighter. The cameras caught the movement. On the arena's massive screens, Seagal's approving nod appeared larger than life. Looks like Steven Seagal appreciated that display, the color commentator noted. The action star seems impressed by Reynolds' performance. Near him, Chuck Norris remained still. Shoulders relaxed, gaze sharp, expression unreadable. He watched everything. Every move. Every taunt. He didn't clap. He didn't react. He simply observed, occasionally leaning over to exchange a quiet word with his wife. Between interviews at the edge of the cage, Reynolds caught sight of Seagal's approval. His grin widened as he pointed at the action star, calling out, "That's how it's done. Old school meets new school." Seagal acknowledged him with another slow nod, raising a fist slightly in recognition. The energy in the arena shifted subtly. Fans near the front rows began pointing toward the VIP section, nudging friends, phones raised to capture the exchange between the young fighter and the aging action star. Social media was already buzzing with clips of the knockout, and now with images of Seagal's apparent endorsement. "Quite a night already," the lead announcer continued, "and we're only through the undercard. The main event is still to come, and the atmosphere in the MGM Grand is absolutely electric." His partner chimed in, "And with legends like Seagal and Wait, is that Chuck Norris also at ringside?" "Yes, it appears Chuck Norris is here tonight as well. 2 martial arts icons in the house for this championship bout." The cameras panned to Norris, who gave a brief, humble wave to acknowledge the mention, then returned to his conversation. No flashy gestures, no playing to the crowd, just quiet dignity. As the cage was prepared for the next fight, the arena buzzed with conversation. Fans discussed Reynolds' brutal victory, debated his tactics, and now, increasingly, commented on the presence of the 2 action legends at ringside. "I heard Seagal still trains fighters," one fan said to his friend. "Guys pushing 70, and claims he can still take down men half his age." "Norris was the real deal, though," his companion argued. 6-time karate champion before he ever made a movie. Different level. Similar conversations rippled throughout the arena. Comparisons, arguments about who was tougher in their prime, who had more authentic skills. On the big screen, Highlights from Reynolds' victory played on loop: the knockout punch, the fallen opponent, the victor's cocky celebration. Interspersed were reaction shots. The shocked crowd, the concerned medics, Seagal's approving nod, Norris's stoic observation. The commentators filled time between bouts, building narrative tension. "Reynolds certainly making a statement tonight," the lead announcer said. "That's the kind of ruthless efficiency that's making him one of the most talked about fighters in the division, though his sportsmanship leaves something to be desired." "Speaking of fighters," his partner added, "interesting to see both Steven Seagal and Chuck Norris here tonight. Two very different approaches to martial arts stardom. Seagal, with his Aikido background, known for those devastating joint locks in films like Above the Law, while Norris built his reputation on traditional karate and those legendary spinning kicks." The camera caught Seagal again, now leaning forward, elbows on knees, surveying the arena like a man accustomed to being watched. His presence commanded attention, deliberate and imposing. When he spoke to a nearby security guard, he did so without turning his head, expecting the man to lean in to hear him. Norris, meanwhile, posed for a quick photo with a young fighter who had approached respectfully between bouts. He smiled warmly, shook the man's hand, and offered what appeared to be a few encouraging words before the fighter retreated, beaming with appreciation. The contrast wasn't lost on the crowd, or the commentators. Two martial arts icons with very different public personas, the announcer noted. "The night is young, folks, and the energy in this arena is absolutely buzzing. Main card coming up next, and you can feel the anticipation building." As the next fighters were announced, the crowd's attention returned to the cage, but something had shifted. The presence of the two legends had added another layer of electricity to the already charged atmosphere, as if the arena now held not just the current battle, but echoes of battles past. History and legacy sat ringside, watching the new generation with very different eyes. In the VIP section, Seagal shifted in his seat, adjusting his position to face more directly toward the cage. As he did, his gaze briefly passed over Norris. For a flickering moment, something crossed his face, a tightening around the eyes, a subtle hardening of his mouth, before he returned his attention to the ring where the next fight was about to begin. The night was indeed young, and beneath the surface of the spectacle, currents were moving that had nothing to do with the scheduled bouts. As the lights dimmed for the introduction of the next fighters, a tension remained in the air, unspoken but palpable, like the calm before a storm. The second undercard fight ended with less drama than the first, a technical submission that had the crowd appreciating skill over spectacle. As the fighters exited the cage, the arena hummed with conversation and movement. Fans stretched their legs, rushed to concession stands, or huddled over phones comparing highlights from the fight so far. The house lights came up slightly during this brief intermission, illuminating the sea of faces that packed the MGM Grand. In the VIP section, Steven Seagal remained in his seat, now surrounded by a small cluster of admirers who had made their way to the front. He signed autographs with practiced indifference, barely looking at the people as they approached. His energy was of a man doing a favor rather than connecting with fans. "Aikido's the only real martial art with practical application," he was saying to a young fighter who had asked for advice. "These MMA guys, they're athletes, sure. But in a real street situation." He made a dismissive gesture. "Too many rules in that cage." 20 feet away, Chuck Norris was engaged in his own conversation, with a group that included several veterans wearing service caps. His approach couldn't have been more different, listening intently, asking questions, placing a supportive hand on an older veteran's shoulder. When he spoke, he leaned in rather than projecting his voice, creating intimacy rather than demanding attention. Between them, a commentator with a wireless microphone was conducting roving interviews for the broadcast. He finished with a group of fans and, spotting the cluster around Seagal, headed in that direction, camera operator in tow. "Steven Seagal! Great to have you here tonight," the commentator said, extending his microphone. "Any thoughts on the fight so far?" Seagal straightened, adjusting his tinted glasses with deliberate slowness. "The Reynolds kid has potential. Raw, but he understands intimidation is half the battle. These other guys?" He shrugged. "Sport fighters. Nothing special." The commentator nodded eagerly. "You've trained with some MMA fighters in the past. Anyone catch your eye in today's lineup that you'd want to work with?" "I don't really train fighters anymore," Seagal replied, voice low and measured. "My techniques are too effective for the ring, too dangerous." He leaned back, surveying the arena. Most of these guys aren't ready for that level of commitment anyway. The camera operator subtly panned to include Chuck Norris in the background of the shot, and the commentator seized the opportunity. "Speaking of legends, Chuck Norris is also here tonight. You two have never worked together, despite defining the martial arts film genre in different eras. Any thoughts on Chuck's legacy?" Something flashed in Seagal's eyes, a momentary hardening. He turned slightly, glancing in Norris's direction, then back to the commentator. "Chuck?" He chuckled, the sound devoid of warmth. "Look, he had his moment. Those old karate tournament techniques made for cute movies back in the day." His voice lowered, but the microphone caught every word. "But let's be honest, he's a washed-up fighter living on nostalgia and internet jokes. I was dealing with real-world applications while he was doing choreographed roundhouse kicks." The commentator's eyes widened, sensing he'd just captured broadcast gold. "That's, quite a take on a fellow martial arts icon." "I'm just being honest," Seagal continued, seemingly warming to his subject. "There's martial arts for show and martial arts for real. Anyone who actually knows fighting understands the difference." The camera operator had already pivoted, capturing Norris in the background. Though it wasn't clear if he had heard the comment, several fans around him had. Their expressions shifted from excitement to shock, heads turning between the two action stars. The commentator, recognizing the potential explosion he'd just ignited, quickly thanked Seagal and moved away. But the damage was done. As he retreated, his voice could be heard on the broadcast. "Well, folks, it seems Steven Seagal has some rather strong opinions about Chuck Norris. That was unexpected." Like wildfire, the comments spread. Fans who had been watching the broadcast on screens throughout the venue turned to look at the VIP section. Those who had heard it firsthand leaned to tell others. Within minutes, the murmur had grown, rippling through sections of the crowd. "Did you hear what Seagal just said about Norris? He called him washed up. Man, that's disrespectful. Typical Seagal, though. Right?" The broadcast team, recognizing the narrative gold they'd stumbled upon, replayed the clip on the arena's big screens during the intermission. Seagal's dismissive comments followed by a tight shot of Norris in conversation, unaware of what had just been said. The main commentator's voice came over the speakers. "Some unexpected drama developing at ringside, folks. Steven Seagal with some rather pointed comments about fellow action star Chuck Norris, who was also in attendance tonight. The two martial arts legends have never crossed paths professionally, but there seems to be some tension in the air now." His partner added, "Quite disrespectful, considering Norris's legitimate competitive background. Six-time karate champion before his film career even began. By now, people near Norris were showing him clips on their phones." His expression remained measured, but a subtle shift occurred. A straightening of his shoulders, a focusing of his gaze. He said something quietly to his wife, who placed a hand on his arm with a concerned look. Across the VIP section, Seagal seemed to be enjoying the stir he'd created. He hadn't moved but now sat with a slightly more pronounced smirk, still surrounded by his small entourage, but clearly aware of the ripples spreading throughout the arena. The energy in the venue transformed. What had been anticipation for the next fight now became something more charged. Fans began to choose sides, their voices growing louder. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" A chant started in one section. Another group countered. "Seagal! Seagal!" The broadcast team, sensing the unexpected narrative, kept their cameras trained on both men, even as preparations continued for the next bout. "This is quite extraordinary," the lead commentator said. "We came for MMA action, but we might be witnessing the beginnings of a different kind of showdown." His partner agreed. Two icons of martial arts cinema, both in their 70s, but clearly the rivalry is very much alive. Seagal with those dismissive comments, and now the crowd seems to be taking sides. The Chuck chants grew stronger, spreading to multiple sections. Norris's decades of goodwill, his charitable work, his humble persona, all had earned him genuine affection from fans that was now expressing itself in vocal support. The Seagal supporters were fewer but equally passionate, drawn to his unapologetic bravado and the mystique he had cultivated around his martial arts abilities. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Security personnel began to look concerned, exchanging glances and talking into their radios. What had been a standard fight night was veering into unpredictable territory. Through it all, Norris remained seated, his expression controlled, but his eyes now fixed on Seagal. Decades of discipline showed in his restraint, but something had clearly shifted in his demeanor. The casual conversation with those around him had ceased. Now he simply waited, measured, and focused. Seagal, for his part, continued to hold court, seemingly pleased with the chaos he had sparked. He gestured expansively as he spoke to those around him, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby fans. "People can't handle the truth," he was saying. "Real martial arts isn't about tournaments and trophies. It's about effectiveness. Always has been." The next fighters were ready to enter the cage, but the crowd's attention remained divided. The UFC officials huddled at the edge of the octagon, clearly discussing how to proceed with the program while this unexpected sideshow was developing. Finally, the ring announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next fighters to the octagon." The lights dimmed, entrance music blared. But the Chuck chants continued underneath it all. A persistent current of support that refused to be silenced by the official program. As the new fighters entered, cameras caught Norris leaning forward slightly, eyes still fixed on Seagal. For the first time, he seemed to be considering a response. His wife whispered something in his ear, but he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The lead commentator noticed the movement. "Folks, Chuck Norris appears to be processing Seagal's comments. The man is known for his composure, but even legends have their limits when it comes to disrespect." His partner added, "If you're just joining us, Steven Seagal called Chuck Norris a washed-up fighter living on nostalgia just minutes ago, and the arena has been reacting ever since." The chants evolved, some fans now calling directly for confrontation. "Face him, Chuck," and "Stand up, Seagal." Security personnel moved closer to the VIP section, positioning themselves strategically between the two stars and their respective supporters. Through it all, the contrast between the two men remained stark. Seagal continued his expansive gestures, clearly playing to the crowd and cameras. Norris remained still, watchful, his energy contained rather than projected. Two approaches to not just martial arts, but to life itself, sat in opposition across the arena floor. one built on spectacle and declaration, the other on quiet competence and earned respect. As the next fight began in the cage, an unspoken question hung in the air. Which approach would prevail when pushed to its limits? The bell rang for the next bout. But for many in the arena, the real fight was yet to come. The crowd's divided attention made the third fight feel like a mere backdrop to the brewing tension in the VIP section. The fighters in the cage, legitimate athletes risking their health for glory, found themselves in the unusual position of being secondary to the drama unfolding at ringside. As the third round began, Steven Seagal rose from his seat. His movement was deliberate, calculated to draw attention. The clusters of fans who had been watching him rather than the fight immediately nudged their neighbors, pointing, phone cameras swiveled in his direction. Seagal adjusted his silk shirt, smoothed back his ponytail, and began to make his way along the row, not toward the exit, but directly toward the section where Chuck Norris sat. The camera operators, who had been dividing their attention between the fight and the simmering situation at ringside, immediately focused on Seagal's movement. On the arena's big screens, his purposeful stride appeared alongside the ongoing fight, creating a split-screen effect that perfectly captured the dual narratives of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the lead commentator said, his voice betraying his excitement, "Steven Seagal appears to be approaching Chuck Norris's section. After those comments earlier, this could be, well, I'm not sure what this could be, but security is definitely taking notice." Indeed, 3 security personnel had detached from their positions and were moving to intercept Seagal, though their uncertainty was visible in their hesitant approach. How exactly does one stop a 7th-degree Aikido black belt with a decades-long reputation for being dangerous? Seagal ignored them, continuing his measured walk toward Norris. The crowd began to notice en masse, a wave of awareness spreading from the floor to the upper decks. The cheers for the fight diminished as attention shifted. New chants started, some supportive of Seagal, but the majority backing Norris. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The referee in the cage glanced out at the crowd, momentarily confused by the chants that clearly weren't related to the fighters he was supervising. Norris remained seated, though his posture had changed. He now sat forward slightly, elbows on knees, watching Seagal's approach with unwavering focus. His wife placed a hand on his shoulder, concern evident in her gesture. When Seagal was halfway to Norris's position, he stopped. Standing in the aisle between sections, he raised a hand, gesturing for a microphone. A nearby UFC staff member hesitated, then handed over his headset mic. The sound system crackled as it was activated, and Seagal's voice boomed throughout the arena, instantly silencing the fight commentary. "I understand Chuck took offense to my honest assessment earlier," Seagal began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his films, low, deliberate, with affected gravity. "But facts are facts. Some of us evolved with martial arts. Others got stuck in the tournament mentality." He gestured toward Norris with an open palm. "Chuck was great in his time. The Walker, Texas Ranger era. The memes. Very cute." His voice carried a patronizing edge that drew boos from sections of the crowd. "But there's a difference between choreographed kicks for TV and the real applications I've been teaching federal agents and special forces for decades." The boos grew louder, but Seagal continued, seemingly feeding off the reaction. "I've always respected him as an entertainer. But as a martial artist?" He shrugged dramatically. "There are levels to this. Always have been." The camera operator had positioned himself to capture both Seagal's speech and Norris's reaction in the background. On the big screens, the contrast was striking. Seagal grand and declarative, Norris watchful and contained. So if Chuck has something to say about that, Seagal continued, he's welcome to say it to my face. Right here. Right now. He spread his arms wide in invitation. Unless he'd rather stick to signing autographs for his glory days. The arena erupted a mixture of cheers, boos, and gasps of disbelief. The actual fight in the cage had become completely secondary. Even the fighters had paused to watch the drama unfolding outside their domain. Security personnel looked to UFC officials for guidance, clearly uncertain about how to handle this unexpected situation. The broadcast director made a quick decision, cutting the main feed entirely to the confrontation. Recognizing that this was now the main event as far as viewers were concerned. Unprecedented scenes here at the MGM Grand, the commentator said, his professional tone giving way to genuine amazement. Steven Seagal has directly challenged Chuck Norris, calling into question his legitimacy as a martial artist. His partner added, "For those unfamiliar with their backgrounds, this is particularly audacious." Norris was a legitimate full-contact karate champion before his film career, while Seagal's competitive record has always been more, let's say, discussed rather than documented. In his seat, Chuck Norris finally moved. With calm deliberation, he whispered something to his wife, then stood. Unlike Seagal's theatrical rise, Norris's movement was efficient and unadorned. He simply stood, centered and balanced, his posture revealing decades of disciplined training. The crowd response was immediate and overwhelming. The Chuck chants grew deafening, reverberating through the arena with such force that the cage itself seemed to vibrate. Fans who had been seated leapt to their feet, phones raised to capture what was quickly becoming the most unexpected moment in recent UFC history. Norris didn't immediately approach Seagal. Instead, he simply stood his ground, eyes locked on his challenger. When he finally extended his hand toward a nearby staff member, the gesture was so understated that it took the young woman a moment to realize he was asking for a microphone. She quickly handed him her headset. Unlike Seagal, Norris tested it with a gentle tap before speaking, considerate of the sound technicians and the audience's ears. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, lacking the affected gravitas of Seagal's delivery. This wasn't performance. It was communication. "Steven," he began, using Seagal's first name with neither familiarity nor disrespect. "I've never publicly criticized a fellow martial artist. That's not my way." The arena grew quieter, fans straining to hear his words. "I believe martial arts is about respect, discipline, humility." Each word landed with simple clarity. Not about who can talk the loudest about their own abilities. Cheers erupted. But Norris raised a hand slightly, asking for quiet. The crowd, remarkably, complied. "I'm 75 years old," he continued. "I don't have anything to prove to you or anyone else. My record, both in competition and in life, speaks for itself." Seagal's expression tightened, the smirk faltering slightly at Norris's refusal to engage on his terms. "But," Norris added, his tone shifting subtly, "I also believe that disrespect should not go unanswered." The crowd erupted again, sensing what was coming. "So, if you have something to prove, Steven," Norris said, his gaze unwavering, "I'm right here." With those simple words, Chuck Norris handed the microphone back to the staff member and began walking toward the aisle, not with Seagal's theatrical stride, but with the measured pace of a man who had confronted challenges his entire life, and faced each one with the same steady resolve. The contrast in their approaches could not have been more stark. Seagal had made a show. Norris was making a point. Security personnel moved alongside Norris, not restraining him but clearly uncertain about what they should do in this unprecedented situation. The UFC officials were in rapid conversation at the edge of the octagon. torn between their responsibility to the scheduled program and their recognition that what was unfolding might be the most viewed UFC moment in years. The official fight in the cage had completely stalled. The referee had called a temporary pause, as neither fighter could focus while this drama played out just feet away. They stood in their corners, as captivated as everyone else by the confrontation between the aging action stars. Seagal's expression fluctuated between smugness and uncertainty. He had clearly anticipated either being ignored, which would let him claim victory, or provoking an angry outburst that would make Norris appear unhinged. The measured, dignified response had not been in his calculation. As Norris approached, Seagal adjusted his stance, slightly widening his base, shifting his weight to the balls of his feet. For all his bluster, the man did have legitimate martial arts training, and those instincts were kicking in. The lead commentator's voice was hushed with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been covering combat sports for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Two icons of martial arts cinema, both in their 70s, appear to be on a collision course right here at the MGM Grand." His partner added, "The security team seems completely unsure of how to proceed. I mean, who would want to be the person who tried to stop Chuck Norris?" The crowd's energy had transformed again from the initial shock and division to a unified anticipation. Whatever loyalties fans had walked in with, they were now united in their desire to witness this once-in-a-lifetime confrontation. The chants evolved into a single word, repeated with increasing intensity. "Face. Off. Face. Off. Face. Off." Norris was now just 15 feet from Seagal, his approach unhurried but unwavering. His eyes never left Seagal's face, reading every micro-expression, every shift in posture. Seagal, perhaps sensing that the situation was veering from his script, raised the microphone again. "Now this is more like it," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. "The real Chuck Norris finally shows up." He gestured toward the cage. "Should we take this inside the octagon? Give these people a real show?" It was a calculated move, framing the confrontation as entertainment rather than a genuine test of his earlier claims. But the crowd wasn't having it. Boos rained down, fans seeing through the attempt to transform a moment of accountability into spectacle. Norris continued his approach, unaffected by Seagal's words. When he was 10 feet away, he finally spoke again, his voice carrying naturally without the microphone. "This isn't about shows, Stephen." The words were clear enough to be picked up by nearby broadcast mics. "This is about respect, for the arts we both claim to represent, for the fans who supported our careers." He took another step forward. "And for the truth." The simplicity of his statement hung in the air, cutting through Seagal's theatrics like a blade through silk. The arena fell into a hushed anticipation, thousands of people collectively holding their breath. Seagal's next move would define not just the evening, but perhaps his entire legacy. The silence that gripped the MGM Grand was the kind that only comes when thousands of people collectively hold their breath. For 5 eternal seconds, nothing moved. Norris stood perfectly still, 10 feet from Seagal, waiting. Seagal remained in place, microphone still in hand, his usual mask of confidence, showing hairline fractures. The broadcast cameras captured every nuance. Seagal's slight adjustment of his stance, the focused calm in Norris's eyes. The security personnel frozen in indecision at the edges of the frame. On screens throughout the venue and streaming to millions worldwide, this unexpected standoff had become the main event. When Seagal finally moved, it was with deliberate showmanship. He handed the microphone to a nearby staff member, then slowly removed his tinted glasses, tucking them into his shirt pocket. His movements were theatrical, designed for maximum visual impact. "Chuck," he said, his voice pitched to carry without the microphone. Let's give these people what they came for. With that, he turned and walked directly toward the octagon, his stride confident, arms swinging loosely at his sides. The implied invitation was clear. Follow me into the cage. The crowd's reaction was immediate roars of approval mixed with continued chants of, "Chuck, Chuck, Chuck." Fans pushed forward against the barricades, phones raised high to capture what was quickly becoming UFC legend. Norris watched Seagal's retreat for a moment, then turned to glance at his wife. She gave him a small nod, not encouragement, exactly, but understanding. After 40 years of marriage, she knew her husband would not let disrespect stand unchallenged, regardless of the circumstances. With the same measured pace as before, Norris followed Seagal toward the cage. His movement lacked the swagger of his opponent, but carried an unmistakable purpose that sent ripples of anticipation through the crowd. UFC officials scrambled at the edge of the octagon, engaged in heated debate about whether to allow this unprecedented situation to continue. The scheduled fighters still stood in their corners, uncertain whether to exit or remain. The lead official made a rapid decision, gesturing for the current fighters to exit the cage. This wasn't about the planned program anymore. This was about capturing a moment that would be replayed for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," the commentator's voice trembled with barely contained excitement. "It appears the octagon is being cleared. Steven Seagal is approaching the cage, with Chuck Norris following. I honestly cannot believe what we're witnessing." His partner was equally stunned. Two legends of martial arts cinema, both well into their 70s, appear to be taking their decades-long philosophical differences into the UFC octagon. I don't even have words for what this is. As Seagal reached the cage, a UFC staff member hesitantly opened the gate. The action star ducked through with practiced ease, immediately turning to face the crowd with arms spread wide, soaking in the reaction. He moved to the center of the octagon, claiming the space as if it were a movie set arranged for his personal showcase. When Norris reached the cage moments later, his entrance couldn't have been more different. He nodded thanks to the staff member holding the gate, then stepped through without flourish. He took a moment to orient himself in this unfamiliar arena, eyes tracking the 8 sides of the enclosure, the padded flooring, the chain-link fencing that now separated them from the outside world. The two men stood 20 feet apart in the octagon's Seagal center stage, Norris just inside the gate. The contrast in their demeanors told its own story. One man performing, the other simply being. The octagon's bright lights cast harsh shadows across both men's faces, emphasizing the lines earned through decades of very different journeys. Seagal's features appeared sharp and theatrical under the glare, while Norris's weathered countenance remained composed, his eyes clear and focused. "I never imagined we'd see this," the lead commentator whispered, his voice carrying the reverence of someone witnessing history. Two defining figures of martial arts cinema, face to face in the UFC octagon. His partner added, "Chuck Norris, legitimate karate champion turned actor, versus Steven Seagal, whose Aikido and film career have always been surrounded by both mystique and controversy. Different eras, different styles, different philosophies all coming to a head tonight." Inside the cage, Seagal began to circle slowly, his footwork deliberate and exaggerated. Each step was a performance, arms held at precise angles, fingers slightly splayed in the ready position characteristic of his Aikido background. He moved with the affected grace of someone highly conscious of being watched. "Still think I'm just talk, Chuck?" Seagal called across the distance, his voice carrying enough to be picked up by the cage microphones. "Hollywood stunts versus real technique. Let's settle it." Norris remained where he stood, making only the smallest adjustments to maintain his position relative to Seagal's movement. His stance was natural, balanced, nothing showy, nothing wasted. When he finally spoke, his voice was level and controlled. "Stephen, I've spent 60 years in martial arts," he said. "Never once felt the need to tell someone how good I was." A slight pause. "People who know. The crowd erupted at this simple statement, recognizing the philosophical divide it represented. Martial arts as spectacle versus martial arts as discipline. Proclamation versus demonstration. Seagal's circle tightened, bringing him closer to Norris. His expression flickered between confidence and something less certain, the look of a man discovering that the script he had written wasn't being followed. The UFC officials had made a rapid decision to treat this as an official, if unprecedented, exhibition. The referee, who had been overseeing the previous fight, cautiously entered the cage, approaching both men with the uncertainty of someone who never expected to be officiating a confrontation between two septuagenarian film stars. "Gentlemen," he began, "if you're determined to do this, we need to establish some basic—" Seagal cut him off with a dismissive wave. "We don't need rules. This isn't sport." He fixed his gaze on Norris. "This is about who's real and who's been faking it for the cameras." The referee looked to Norris, who gave him a small nod of understanding. "Safety first," Norris said quietly. "Always." That simple exchange further highlighted the gulf between them. One man dismissing structure, the other respecting it, even in this extraordinary circumstance. The young fighter, Aiden Reynolds, who had won so dramatically earlier, had pushed his way to the edge of the cage. He hung on the fence, eyes wide with the disbelief of someone watching his cinematic heroes step into his world. "This is insane," he said to no one in particular, his earlier bravado momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine martial arts history unfolding before him. Inside the octagon, Seagal had completed his circle and now stood directly across from Norris, perhaps 12 feet separating them. His theatrical stance had solidified, weight slightly forward, hands positioned for the joint manipulations that characterized his Aikido style. "Last chance to back down, Chuck," he offered, voice pitched to carry to the crowd. "No shame in admitting you're out of your depth." Norris adjusted his position slightly, settling into a stance that reflected his karate background, balanced, grounded, efficient. Nothing flashy, nothing wasted. His eyes never left Seagal's, reading every micro-movement, every tell. "I'm not here to talk, Stephen," he replied simply. The crowd's roar built again, sensing the confrontation was moments away from becoming physical. Phone cameras flashed like strobe lights around the arena, everyone desperate to capture what was quickly becoming the most unexpected moment in UFC history. The referee, recognizing that he had limited control over the situation, stepped back toward the fence but remained vigilant. Whatever happened next would largely be determined by the two men themselves. Seagal moved first, stepping forward with an exaggerated Aikido entry. Arms extended, hands open, movements flowing with practiced precision. It was textbook technique, the kind demonstrated in dojos around the world, executed with the confidence of someone who had been performing these movements for decades. But something was immediately, visibly wrong. The technique, while visually impressive, had a theatrical quality to it. Slightly too large, slightly too slow, designed more for camera angles than combat effectiveness. It was Aikido as performance, rather than Aikido as practical application. Norris read the movement instantly. With minimal adjustment, he simply wasn't where Seagal's technique expected him to be. He sidestepped with an economy of motion that spoke to years of practical application, not demonstration. The commentators caught it immediately. Seagal initiates with a classic Aikido entry, but Norris just isn't there. Seagal's momentum carried him slightly past his target. He recovered quickly, turning to face Norris again, but something had changed. The theatrical confidence in his expression had faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. This wasn't going according to the scenario he had imagined. The crowd sensed it too. The chants for Norris grew louder, more unified. They weren't just supporting a celebrity. They were recognizing the difference between claimed skill and demonstrated competence. Seagal reset his position and approached again, this time with less flourish and more focus. His second attempt was tighter, more practical. A direct entry aimed at controlling Norris's center line. Norris remained economical in his response. No wasted movement, no unnecessary steps. He pivoted slightly, used his forearm to redirect Seagal's lead hand, and established position. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply effective. "Look at that!" the color commentator exclaimed. Chuck Norris just neutralized Seagal's approach with the most basic principle of combat position before submission. Nothing flashy. Just fundamentally sound technique. Seagal backed off slightly, reassessing. The crowd's reaction had clearly registered they were seeing through the performance to the substance beneath. Or in this case, the lack thereof. "You've been running from a real confrontation for decades," Seagal said, his voice carrying a new edge of frustration. Always hiding behind choreography and camera cuts, Norris didn't respond verbally. He didn't need to. His positioning, his calm focus, his readiness all spoke more eloquently than words ever could. Seagal moved in again, this time abandoning some of the Aikido formality for a more direct approach. He launched a series of strikes, a jab, followed by a circular hand technique designed to trap Norris's lead arm. Again, Norris's response was measured and precise. He slipped the jab, neutralized the trap attempt, and established a superior position with such subtle efficiency that many in the crowd missed the technical brilliance of it. There were no spinning kicks, no dramatic throws, just the quiet mastery of fundamental principles applied with precision. "Folks, what we're seeing here is fascinating," the lead commentator observed. "Seagal is giving us technique as performance, while Norris is demonstrating technique as function. It's like watching two different interpretations of what martial arts even is." The contrast was becoming more apparent with each exchange. Seagal's movements remained large, designed to be seen and appreciated. Norris's were compact, designed to be effective regardless of who was watching. After several more exchanges followed the same pattern, a shift occurred in the arena's energy. What had begun as excitement for a confrontation between celebrities had evolved into something more profound. An object lesson in substance versus style, in earned respect versus claimed authority. The young fighter, Reynolds, who had been watching intently from the cage side, seemed particularly affected. His expression had transformed from excitement to something closer to thoughtful respect, particularly when watching Norris's economical movements. Inside the octagon, Seagal's frustration was becoming more evident. His techniques grew larger, more exaggerated, as if increasing the visual impact might somehow improve their effectiveness. His breathing had become labored, sweat now visible on his brow, despite the relatively limited physical exertion. "This isn't a real fight," he declared, loud enough for nearby microphones to pick up. "In a real situation with no rules." "There are always rules, Stephen," Norris interrupted, his voice calm but carrying. "Discipline. Control. Respect for your opponent." He settled back into his ready position. "That's what separates martial arts from just fighting." The crowd erupted at this simple wisdom, recognizing the decades of authentic philosophy behind it. Seagal launched another attack, this time with visible frustration behind it. The movement was faster but less controlled. Power prioritized over precision. He drove forward with a direct strike followed by an attempted joint lock, the signature move from his films, executed with the confidence of someone who had performed it hundreds of times on camera. Norris met the attack with characteristic efficiency. He didn't avoid it entirely, instead, he controlled it, redirecting Seagal's energy while establishing his own dominant position. It was a masterclass in the core principle that united all effective martial arts: position before submission, control before power. For a brief moment, the two men were locked in a clinch, closer than they had been at any point. In that proximity, something passed between them, a recognition visible only to those watching the close-up camera feeds on the arena screens. Seagal's eyes revealed the dawning realization that he was outmatched not by superior strength or speed, but by superior fundamentals and authenticity. When they separated, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Seagal's theatrical confidence had crumbled, replaced by the uncertainty of a man confronting the difference between his cultivated image and his actual capabilities. Norris, by contrast, remained exactly as he had been from the beginning: centered, focused, authentic. His expression held neither triumph nor contempt, just the steady concentration of someone completing a necessary task. The referee, sensing the shift, moved closer. The UFC officials at cageside exchanged glances, uncertain whether to allow the increasingly one-sided demonstration to continue. Around the arena, phones remained raised, but the crowd's energy had transformed from bloodthirsty anticipation to something more reflective. They were witnessing not just a physical confrontation, but a philosophical reckoning, the unveiling of truth behind decades of carefully constructed mythology. In that moment, with thousands watching in person and millions more through broadcasts and live streams, the octagon had become more than just a fighting cage. It had become a crucible where claims met reality, where reputations were either validated or exposed, and the verdict was becoming increasingly clear to everyone watching. The tension in the octagon had shifted from anticipation to revelation. What had begun as a clash of egos was transforming into something more profound: a public reckoning between substance and spectacle. The crowd's mood reflected this evolution, the bloodthirsty chants giving way to a more focused attention as fans began to recognize they were witnessing something beyond a simple confrontation. Seagal stood at the center of the cage, his breathing now visibly labored, sweat darkening the collar of his silk shirt. The controlled persona he had maintained for decades was fracturing under the harsh arena lights. His eyes darted between Norris and the crowd, the calculation behind them growing more desperate with each passing moment. Norris remained composed, his stance natural and balanced. Despite being the older of the two at 75, his conditioning spoke to a lifetime of genuine discipline. His breathing was steady, his focus unwavering. When he moved, it was with purpose rather than performance. "We're witnessing something extraordinary here," the lead commentator observed, his voice hushed with a newfound respect. "This isn't just about two action stars anymore. This is about two fundamentally different approaches to martial arts playing out before our eyes." His partner agreed. Seagal represents martial arts as mythology, the cultivated mystique, the grand claims, the theatrical techniques designed to impress more than function. Norris embodies martial arts as methodology, the fundamentals, the earned discipline, the practical application honed through actual competition. Inside the cage, Seagal seemed to sense that the narrative was slipping from his control. With a visible shift in his demeanor, he launched forward with renewed intensity, abandoning some of the Aikido formality for more aggressive striking techniques. "Let's see how tournament karate holds up against real pressure," he shouted, voice strained as he unleashed a flurry of hand strikes aimed at overwhelming Norris's defenses through sheer volume. The attack was impressive for a man in his 70s, fast, committed, powerful. In films, it would have looked devastating. Against a choreographed opponent, it would have ended the scene. But this wasn't a film set, and Chuck Norris wasn't following a script. With remarkable economy, Norris slipped the initial strikes, parried the follow-ups, and maintained his positioning throughout the barrage. Where Seagal expended energy in dramatic movements, Norris conserved his through precise, minimal adjustments. The contrast in their approaches couldn't have been starker, one man fighting the opponent in front of him, the other performing for the audience around him. Incredible defensive fundamentals from Norris, the commentator noted. He's not even attempting to counter yet, just demonstrating the first principle of combat mastery: don't be where the attack is. As Seagal's combination ended, momentum carried him slightly past his target. In that moment of vulnerability, Norris finally moved offensively, not with the spinning kicks that had made him famous in films, but with basic, foundational techniques executed with flawless precision. A simple sidekick to Seagal's lead leg disrupted his balance. A textbook straight punch, pulled just short of full impact, snapped against his chest protector. A sweep timed perfectly to his compromised footing sent him stumbling backward. Dignity crumbling faster than his stance. The crowd erupted, but not with the bloodthirsty roar that accompanies knockouts in traditional UFC bouts. This was different appreciation for technical mastery, for the validation of substance over style. They were witnessing not destruction but revelation, the difference between claiming to be something and actually being it. Seagal regained his footing, but something had changed in his expression. The confident mask had slipped entirely, revealing the uncertainty beneath. For perhaps the first time in his public life, he was being seen clearly, without the protection of camera angles, choreographed opponents, or cultivated mystique. "This is exactly what I expected," he declared, voice betraying the opposite. Tournament karate, all-point fighting. No real application. Norris didn't respond to the taunt. Instead, he simply reset his position and waited, allowing Seagal's words to hang empty in the air. The contrast spoke volumes, one man still trying to win through declaration, the other content to let demonstration speak for itself. The young fighter, Reynolds, who had been watching intently from cage side, turned to a veteran coach standing nearby. "I've been doing it all wrong, haven't I?" he asked quietly, the brash confidence of his earlier victory now tempered by what he was witnessing. Inside the octagon, Seagal attempted to reclaim the initiative. He closed distance again, this time with a series of Aikido entering techniques designed to establish a dominant grip, the precursor to the joint locks and throws that had featured so prominently in his films. Again, Norris's response was masterful in its simplicity. He didn't resist the gripping attempts directly. Instead, he controlled distance and angle with such subtle efficiency that Seagal's techniques consistently fell just short of their targets. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But to the trained eyes watching, it was a clinic in the fundamental principle that defined all effective fighting: position before submission. Folks, what we're seeing here is the difference between martial arts for demonstration and martial arts for application, the commentator explained. Seagal's techniques look impressive when performed against compliant partners, but Norris is showing why fundamentals developed through actual competition will always prevail in unpredictable situations. The frustration building in Seagal was palpable. Each failed technique, each neutralized approach, each moment of being outpositioned chipped away at not just his current situation but the carefully constructed persona of decades. In a desperate attempt to change the dynamic, he abandoned the Aikido methodology entirely and launched a wild, committed overhand strike, the kind of power move that prioritizes damage over technique. Norris's response elevated the lesson to its culmination. Rather than simply avoiding the attack, he controlled it, stepping in rather than away, redirecting rather than resisting, establishing dominance through position rather than power. In one fluid sequence, he trapped Seagal's overextended arm, swept his compromised base, and used his own momentum to take him to the mat. The execution was flawless, controlled, measured, precise. Norris established a dominant position without applying unnecessary pressure or causing injury. It was martial arts as discipline rather than destruction, control rather than harm. Seagal found himself on his back, Norris positioned above him in what MMA fans would recognize as a modified side control. The position was controlling without being humiliating, dominant without being destructive. Norris held it just long enough to make the point undeniable, then disengaged cleanly, returning to his feet with the same efficient movement that characterized everything he did. The arena erupted in cheers that transcended simple fandom. This wasn't just about supporting Chuck Norris. It was about witnessing the triumph of substance over spectacle, of earned respect over claimed authority. Seagal lay on the mat for a moment longer than necessary, the physical defeat secondary to the more profound reckoning taking place. When he finally rose, his movements lacked the theatrical precision he had displayed earlier. The mask had fallen completely now, revealing not a villain, but something more human. A man confronting the gap between his cultivated image and his actual capabilities. "That's not how it would go in a real street fight," he muttered. But the words carried no conviction. Even he seemed to recognize their hollowness. Norris, still composed, still controlled, simply nodded. "Maybe," he conceded, voice free of mockery or triumph. "But we'll never need to find out if we both remember what martial arts is really about." In that simple exchange lay the heart of the lesson, martial arts not as a tool for domination or self-aggrandizement, but as a path toward discipline, respect, and personal growth. The referee moved to the center of the cage, uncertain how to officially conclude this unprecedented exhibition. Before he could speak, Norris extended his hand toward Seagal. Not in triumph, but in reconciliation. It was the gesture of a true martial artist, recognizing that the purpose of the confrontation had never been humiliation, but clarification. For a tense moment, Seagal stared at the offered hand, pride warring with reality. The arena fell silent, thousands collectively holding their breath. In this moment, more than the physical exchanges that preceded it, Seagal's character would be truly revealed. Finally, with visible reluctance that gradually transformed into something closer to resignation, he accepted the handshake. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, not celebrating victory but acknowledging the more difficult triumph of humility over pride. As their hands clasped, Norris spoke quietly, his words picked up by the cage microphones. "The strongest thing a martial artist can do is admit when they've been wrong." It wasn't a barb, but an invitation, a path toward reconciliation, offered from one aging warrior to another. Seagal's response was barely audible, but the cameras caught it. "Easier said than done." "Always is," Norris acknowledged with a slight nod. In that brief exchange, something shifted between them. Not friendship, perhaps, but a recognition of shared humanity beneath the personas they had cultivated for different reasons and with different degrees of authenticity. The UFC officials had finally organized a proper conclusion to the unprecedented event. The arena announcer entered the cage, microphone in hand, looking slightly dazed by the responsibility of contextualizing what had just occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone aware they were participating in a moment that would be replayed for years to come. "We have just witnessed, well, I'm not sure there are words for what we've witnessed." The crowd laughed, tension breaking, the moment shifting from confrontation to collective experience. "But I think it's safe to say that we've all learned something about what martial arts truly represents at its highest level. Please show your appreciation for Chuck Norris and Steven Seagal," The applause was deafening, not for the spectacle they had expected, but for the lesson they had received. As both men moved toward the cage door, the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation that acknowledged something beyond entertainment. They had come for a fight, but had witnessed a demonstration of principles that transcended combat, discipline over display, substance over spectacle, earned respect over claimed authority. Outside the cage, the young fighter Reynolds pushed forward as they exited, his earlier cockiness replaced by something more reflective. He extended his hand toward Norris. Not for an autograph, but in the traditional martial arts gesture of respect. "Mr. Norris," he said, voice carrying genuine humility. "I've been doing it wrong. Haven't I? All the showboating, the trash talk." Norris clasped the young man's hand firmly. "There's a place for excitement and entertainment," he replied, his tone neither condescending nor judgmental. "Just don't let it replace the fundamentals. Character, discipline, respect." Reynolds nodded, absorbing the wisdom with an intensity that suggested the lesson would not be forgotten. Behind him, other fighters had gathered, drawn not by celebrity but by the rare opportunity to witness martial arts philosophy demonstrated in its purest form. As security created a path for both men to leave the arena floor, the contrast in their exits remained telling. Seagal moved quickly, gaze averted, the carefully constructed persona visibly shaken. Norris walked at the same measured pace as always, acknowledging the crowd with simple nods, his demeanor unchanged by either the confrontation or its resolution. The commentators struggled to contextualize what they had witnessed, their usual analysis frameworks inadequate for this unprecedented event. "I think what we just saw transcends fighting," the lead commentator finally offered. "This wasn't about who could hurt whom. It was about the difference between appearing to be something and actually being it." His partner agreed. "In an age of social media and carefully curated personas, we just witnessed what happens when claims meet reality." Chuck Norris didn't say he was a martial arts master. He simply demonstrated what that actually means in technique, in composure, in character. As both legends disappeared into the tunnel leading from the arena floor, the UFC officials scrambled to reset for the actual main event fight. But everyone present knew that whatever happened in the scheduled bout, it would be an afterthought to what they had just witnessed, a moment where substance had triumphed over spectacle, where true strength had revealed itself not through dominance, but through discipline. The lesson would linger long after the lights dimmed on the octagon, a reminder that in martial arts, as in life, respect cannot be demanded through words. It can only be earned through actions. The aftermath of the confrontation spread through the sports world like wildfire. By the time the official main event concluded, a 5-round championship bout that under normal circumstances would have been the evening's highlight, the unexpected showdown between Norris and Seagal had already become the focal point of every sports broadcast, social media feed, and post-fight analysis. In the UFC press room, journalists packed every available space. Laptops open, cameras rolling, all awaiting comments from anyone connected to the unprecedented event. The scheduled fighters found themselves fielding more questions about what they had witnessed at ringside than about their own performances. The young fighter, Aiden Reynolds, had undergone perhaps the most visible transformation. The brash, cocky victor from earlier in the night now spoke with measured consideration, his usual bombastic style noticeably tempered. "Watching that changed something for me," he admitted to the cluster of reporters surrounding him. "I came into this sport thinking it was all about dominating your opponent, making people notice you. But seeing Chuck Norris in that cage, he shook his head, searching for words. That was different. That was martial arts at a level I've never understood before." When pressed about his earlier showboating and trash talk, Reynolds looked genuinely reflective. "Maybe I've been focused on the wrong things. The way Norris carried himself, no trash talk, No showing off, and still commanded more respect than anyone I've ever seen? That's something to think about. Across the venue, in a quiet corridor away from the main exit routes, Chuck Norris stood with his wife and a small circle of longtime friends. Unlike the media frenzy occurring elsewhere, this group maintained a calm center, processing the event with the perspective that comes from decades in martial arts. "You didn't have to do that," his wife said quietly, straightening the collar of his jacket with familiar affection. "But I understand why you did." Norris nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "It wasn't about embarrassing him," he replied. "Some lessons can only be taught through demonstration." A longtime training partner chuckled softly. 60 years I've known you, and you're still teaching the same fundamental lesson. Martial arts isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself." Before Norris could respond, a UFC official approached respectfully. "Mr. Norris, I know you declined the formal press conference, but Dana White would like a private word, if you're willing." Norris nodded his agreement. As he followed the official toward the administrative offices, staff members, security personnel, and fighters stopped what they were doing, offering nods of profound respect as he passed. It wasn't celebrity worship, but something deeper: recognition of a lifetime dedicated to the authentic practice of martial arts principles. In a separate exit corridor, Steven Seagal's experience could not have been more different. Surrounded by a tight circle of personal security, he moved quickly toward the private exit where his vehicle waited, ignoring the calls from journalists and the flashes of cameras. His expression remained tight, unreadable. The carefully constructed mask back in place but visibly strained around the edges. A veteran sports journalist managed to maneuver into his path. "Mr. Seagal, any comment on what happened in the octagon tonight?" Seagal paused, security personnel tensing around him. For a moment, it seemed he might revert to his standard defensive posture, dismissive, superior, aloof. But something had shifted, however slightly. The confrontation in the cage had pierced something fundamental in his cultivated persona. "Sometimes," he said finally, voice lower than his usual projected tone, "you have to face reality, even when it doesn't match the story you've been telling." Without further elaboration, he continued toward the exit, leaving the journalist with a response far more revealing than any defensive bluster would have been. Back in the arena, the cleaning crew had begun the process of breaking down the event setup. But clusters of fans remained, reluctant to leave the venue where they had witnessed something beyond the usual sports spectacle. Many gathered in small groups, not just replaying the physical exchanges, but discussing the deeper implications of what they had seen. "My son's starting martial arts next month," one father said to the group around him. "I'm glad he saw this tonight. It's exactly what I want him to learn, that it's not about looking tough or talking big. It's about character." Others nodded in agreement, the conversation continuing as they slowly made their way toward the exits, still processing the unexpected lesson they had received, along with their entertainment. In the UFC production truck, editors were already assembling footage for what would inevitably become one of the most viewed sequences in combat sports history. The lead producer, a veteran of hundreds of events, watched the montage taking shape on the main screen. "Make sure we include that final handshake," he instructed. "And Norris's quote about admitting when you're wrong. That's the heart of the whole thing." His assistant nodded. "It's strange we've seen hundreds of knockouts more spectacular than this, but nothing has ever felt more, I don't know, important?" "Because it wasn't about the physical exchange," the producer replied. "It was about the principles behind it. About the difference between claiming to be something and actually being it." He gestured to the sequence of Norris's measured, efficient movements, contrasted with Seagal's more theatrical approach. "This isn't just great sports content. This is practically a documentary on the philosophy of martial arts. As the night deepened, the ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread. Social media platforms were flooded with clips, analyses, and conversations that extended far beyond sports forums into discussions of authenticity, humility, and the nature of true strength. The most widely shared moment wasn't one of the physical exchanges, but the final handshake Norris, offering reconciliation rather than humiliation, Seagal finding the humility to accept it. It resonated with people across different backgrounds, different philosophies, different generations. A visual representation of choosing growth over pride, substance over ego. By morning, the story had transcended sports media entirely. News programs, talk shows, and cultural commentators had all picked up the narrative, recognizing that what had occurred went beyond a simple confrontation between aging action stars. In his hotel suite, Chuck Norris sat at the desk, responding to messages from family, friends, and the charitable organizations he had supported for decades. Among them was a text from an unexpected source. The young fighter, Reynolds, whose own victory had been overshadowed by the night's more profound demonstration. "Mr. Norris," it read, "I'm hoping to train differently going forward. Not just physically, but in approach and attitude. If you have time before you leave Vegas, I'd appreciate any guidance." Norris smiled slightly as he typed his reply. "Character first, technique second, fame a distant third. Start there." He set the phone down and turned to his wife, who was preparing for their departure later that morning. "The lesson seems to have landed where it needed to," he observed. She nodded, understanding as only someone who had shared his journey for 4 decades could. It always does, when it's demonstrated rather than declared. Across town, in a considerably more lavish suite, Steven Seagal sat alone, staring at the multitude of notifications lighting up his phone. His team had advised an immediate statement, something to reclaim the narrative, to explain away what had happened in the cage as a misunderstanding or a staged exhibition. But for perhaps the first time in decades, Seagal found himself unwilling to perpetuate the mythology he had so carefully constructed. The confrontation had forced a reckoning not just with Chuck Norris, but with himself, with the gap between the image he projected and the reality he lived. After long consideration, he drafted a simple post. "Last night, I was reminded of an important lesson about martial arts and humility. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is acknowledge when you've been wrong. I have some reflecting to do." His finger hovered over the post button for several seconds before he finally pressed it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grandiose. But it was perhaps the most authentic public statement he had made in years. By midday, as the fighters and fans began departing Las Vegas, returning to their normal lives, the impact of the previous night continued to reverberate. What had begun as an unexpected sideline to a scheduled sporting event had evolved into something approaching a cultural moment, a visible representation of values that extended far beyond martial arts or entertainment. In gyms and dojos across the country, instructors found themselves fielding questions from students who had watched the confrontation, questions not about specific techniques, but about the principles that had been on display. The conversation had shifted from "who would win in a fight" to "what does it mean to be a true martial artist?" 1 week later, the official UFC YouTube channel released a full analysis of the Norris-Seagal confrontation, featuring commentary from fighters, coaches, and martial arts historians. It became their most viewed video within hours, not for its spectacle but for its substance. The final segment featured a quote from Chuck Norris, recorded days after the event. "Martial arts has never been about defeating others. It's about overcoming your own limitations, physical, mental, spiritual. Sometimes that means acknowledging when you've strayed from the path." Steven showed more strength in accepting that handshake than he would have in any physical technique. As the video concluded, the narrator offered a simple observation that captured the essence of what had transpired. In an age where image often trumps substance, where claims regularly outpace capabilities, what we witnessed that night was a return to fundamentals, not just of martial arts, but of character. Chuck Norris didn't need to declare his mastery, he simply demonstrated it. And in doing so, he reminded us all that true strength doesn't announce itself with words. It reveals itself through actions. The screen faded to black, but the lesson lingered, a reminder that in martial arts, as in life, respect cannot be demanded. It can only be earned, one principled action at a time. In an unexpected postscript 3 months later, footage emerged from a small dojo in Colorado. Steven Seagal, dressed in a simple guy rather than his customary all-black attire, was training with a group of students. Gone were the theatrical techniques and grandiose declarations. In their place was something approaching genuine instruction, humbler, more practical, more authentic. When asked about the change by a local reporter, Seagal's response was brief but revealing. Sometimes it takes losing your way to remember why you started the journey in the first place. Chuck Norris, shown the footage during an interview for his latest charitable initiative, offered only a small nod and a simple observation. That's the true victory. Not what happened in the cage, but what happened after. That's martial arts working as it should. And with that, both men continued on their separate paths forever, linked by one unexpected confrontation that had revealed not just the difference between their approaches to martial arts, but the universal principles that transcend any individual style, system, or philosophy. True strength knows itself. False strength must declare itself. The difference, once demonstrated, cannot be unseen. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.